Hello.
Hi. So, thanks for coming, John,
Sure.
today to talk to CUEAFS. Just the first question is, why did you choose your book's Directory of World Cinema of Japan to follow up your book on delegations of independence of American cinema?
Well, my publications record isn't really an accurate representation of where I've been at in terms of research and the films I've been looking at. The long answer to that would be when I was actually writing my book on American independent cinema, which was my PhD topic. Part of the book was really an expression of my frustration with where American independent cinema was at that point in time. I didn't feel there were really a lot of legitimately interesting films coming out of the United States. So while I was actually writing about that, most of the films that I was watching just out of general interest were Asian movies. So I was watching films from Japan and Korea and Taiwan and Thailand and China and Hong Kong. And so I was almost researching, doing something on world cinema as a follow-up while I was still doing the first book. I was then offered the chance to become involved in this World Cinema Directory series by Intellect, who published my first book, and I'd been planning another book on world cinema, which I'm currently writing at the moment, which is a look at industry economics and world cinema in the global form. So it was something I really wanted to be involved in, and I was just given the choice of picking a particular sector, some of which were already taken or other people were involved in. I decided to look at Japan because I was talking about today. It's a sector that has a core industry. It's an industry that's been running for a very long time, has a studio system, and there's a lot to research, and I felt there was a lot of scope to explore over the course of a number of volumes. It wasn't that this is an emerging Asian cinema. It's an Asian cinema that's been here since cinema has really been here. It was a chance to look at something that we could study over a long period of time and have a rich history to go back to, but as I was talking about today, a history which has led to a lot of very interesting and innovative films that are coming out now through a more independent sector.
Okay, cool. So, in your book,
Mm-hmm.
the book of the film of the year, rather, sorry,
Yeah.
is Achiles and the Tortoise
Mm-hmm.
by Kitano.
Yeah.
What was it about that film that you chose to emphasise in your book so much, and why? And you also talk about
Kitano.
Kitano, sorry. Like you talk about him a lot in your book.
Yeah.
Why particularly him, and why his particular film?
Kitano features a lot in the book. Firstly, not necessarily that I talk about him. Obviously, it's an edited collection. Aside from Achilles and the Tortoise, most of the pieces about Kitano are written by other people. Multiple contributors really wanted to write about Kitano. So he's a filmmaker that very much represents Japanese cinema. Maybe not necessarily, as I was talking today, about the current releases or the current independent sector, but he's someone that people very much associate with contemporary Japanese film. He's very much a figurehead, and he's a good entry point for people who are just becoming interested in Japanese film, because there's a huge catalogue of Kitano movies, and he's a major media personality. So Kitano is throughout the book just out of expressions of interest from contributors who really wanted to write about Kitano. They've had a long relationship with his films for 5 to 10 years or more. I picked up on Achilles and the Tortoise personally just because it was a film I very much enjoyed. It's difficult when you use the term film of the year. I always hate end of year polls, and I don't like top 10 lists and what is your favourite film type questions. And when you say film of the year, it's as if you're saying this is the best movie that was made in Japan that year. I don't necessarily think that's the case, because I haven't seen every film that came out of Japan in 2008 to 2009 for obvious reasons. But it's a movie that very much shows where Japanese cinema has come to at a certain point. A director who came through a more independent way of working, who has matured and is now making a film that is almost more in a classical tradition. So I think it's a film that's quite emblematic of a certain type of Japanese movie at this point in time, and a certain maturity and a certain generation of filmmaker. So it was an interesting film to cover more in depth under the banner of Film of the Year.
Also in your book, it's like it's been described as like an A to Z guide
Mm-hmm.
of Japanese cinema,
Yeah.
from anime to like yakuza,
Mm-hmm.
like gangster films.
Yep,
You also got one on pink cinema.
we do.
What do you think of pink cinema, and what do you think of like the film Grotesque, for example? That coming out of Japan, and it's very much influenced Western horror films.
Pink cinema in general, it's not really my specialist area. You'll notice I didn't write extensively about pink cinema. It was the most it was the most challenging section of the book to put together. Part of the problem with covering pink cinema, firstly, is finding people who really want to write about it. It's very much a niche thing. People either love pink cinema and very almost obsessive about it, or read a lot into it and think it's a very interesting sector socially, politically, or just enjoy the exploitation elements. Or people tend to be not interested at all or really have no knowledge. It was the hardest part of the directory to put together, and it was probably, I think it was the last essay that I was able to get at the last minute from a contributor who was very generous with her time. Pink cinema is it's very interesting within the industry, and it's something that the Japanese industry has relied on heavily, pink cinema and Roman porn within certain periods of economic recession, so it's played a very vital economic role as well, and yet it's a sector that people tend to turn away from during other periods, and even when those films are making money and being profitable for studios, they're not really films that people really want to discuss. They're almost the best kept secret in Japanese film. I'm afraid the film you referred to, I'm not actually that familiar with. Is it a pink film or a J horror film?
It's I'd say it's more pink cinema, maybe.
And
it's like.
And in terms of it crossing, you mean in terms of it crossing into the US mainstream, and if there's any, if it can do?
With more like with Saw and that coming out, is like been very heavily influenced by like pink cinema.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm not sure some of the more troubling sexual elements of pink cinema can really cross into the US mainstream. The Saw films and the whole torture porn wave I've found it to be quite unpleasant. It goes away from what I think horror really is supposed to be, and sometimes it's very difficult to watch. There is some influence there from the Asian sector. Certainly, a movie like Eli Roth's film Hostel, he explicitly made that as a tribute to J horror, and he had Takeshi Miike appear in the film in a cameo because it was a nod to Audition and films that he'd seen that had really impressed him over recent years. So there's been some influence coming in, but it largely seems to have been based more on gore and the idea that you can structure films around key set pieces, or that you can use a J horror or perhaps even pink film as a template and structure a movie around 4 or 5 good horror scenes, or 3 good shocks, or just one scene in the middle or the end which is a really good talking point scene, and the rest of the film doesn't really have to be very well produced, but people will come and see the movie because of this one scene as a talking point. The American market seems to have picked up on that slightly negative aspect of J horror, where some of the films aren't really that well made or well structured and are cashing in on a wave, and it's led to another wave in another country that's almost a dilution of a wave, because the original wave wasn't particularly great in the first place. So I see pink cinema and J horror definitely crossing over into the States. I'm not sure if it's always for the better.